We will start the debate by welcoming the first affirmative speaker.
Okay, hello. Am I visible and audible?
Yep.
Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Okay, let's just define really quickly. Widespread use means it's most likely going to be adopted in society. So it's going to be integrated as a standards of how people interact, how people see each other, and how people are going to see each other's traits brought to fruition. And this is going to be a soulbound token. So just as the info slide said, this is not going to be traded. This is something that's going to be permanent. Like this is going to be like permanently attached to your own to your own identity, to your own likeness, to your own whatever, like crypto wallet or whatever. And basically it's going to be your crypto wallet, and basically you have files about yourself attached with it, or your credentials, and the types of things that people attach, like the types of traits and achievements that people attach to you. And we're gonna talk about later like why people can still change and why people are the best arbitrators of each other's traits. So basically, how will these soulbound tokens be employed in real life? There will be a blockchain or ledger to track all the soulbound tokens that are created for people. So for example, in blockchains for cryptocurrency like Bitcoin, people continually update the ledger with all the transactions that take place in a given day. Same will be true on our side of the house, except we'll be continually tracking the souls who give out like these traits to people. So these like tokens to people. We will be able to track wallets and blockchain accounts that like issue these tokens. And because one, there are already mechanisms for this in place in status quo. That is basically how the blockchain works. It works as a giant ledger for everyone to be able to keep track of the transactions that they have to the blockchain. People can update the ledger themselves. The creators of Bitcoin and like for example Ethereum like have these blockchains to be able to like just serve as a history and try to keep it as like secure as possible, because it does hold the personal data of these people and also their money in status quo. But in this case, it is going to be personal data. Two, it's just more difficult for one person to own more than one wallet because of the cost and other adjacent processes. The widespread use will probably look like people owning like 1 or 2 wallets at most. And what will the widespread adoption of this look like? Well, lots of people on the ground will be owning wallets or accounts on the blockchain in order to issue these tokens and be able to receive them. This is something that companies will likely opt into as well in order to track their employees and scout out potential hirees. So if they're gonna give these if you're gonna like work for this certain company and this company is going to be giving you these tokens, then at the same time you're able to like the company can in return be able to give to receive like feedback from the people under them as well. Things like social media will exist alongside this, but it's likely that this platform will not be used to create social media networks, but to determine the characteristic traits and achievements of people and companies alike. Note that even things like LinkedIn exist in status quo. It's much easier for people and entities to edit data about themselves. Therefore, it's likely less of an accurate portrayal or what they actually achieved and what and who they actually are. So what's the comparative on neg? Like, what will they have to defend? Things like social media, where it's much easier to edit information and data about yourself, where individuals and companies themselves have more liberty when it comes to tricking the general public about their credentials or character traits. And it's also much easier for bad actors to be able to escape their accountability. So first, we'll talk to you about like transparency. Basically, when you have this, it's going to be attached to you. So therefore, it is going to be a more transparent way to keep track of people's, for example, credentials, their traits, and like we'll prove later why there is still an incentive to change for people. Okay, first on credentials. When your identity is attached to your achievement, then your wallet becomes your digital CV, like that goes with you wherever you go. So if you move companies, these people will be able to like tag you as, oh, you were working here for this amount of time. This is what we think of you. So it becomes like your character reference and your work history all merged into one like centralized database. People are able to see where you got your degree and what you got your degree in. So basically, this is also going to deter people who are basically just gonna fake their credentials to be able to get a job. Basically, like you're gonna on the company side, you're able to like vet the people that you're actually going to get into your job because they have this credentials attached to their name. For companies, you now have a history of the company on file in a centralized location. So scammy companies, people like the companies who are known to do these, their fans now have it on a record. Business owners who have multiple companies that scam are now able to be seen as like, okay, this company is attached to you, and then these people are calling it this way. So now you're more able to see it because it's in a centralized location than just a bunch of people saying things on the internet. But Neg might say that it's the same with the internet. But like powerful companies are still able to hide data about themselves on the internet, bury it, like like just use like the Google like SEO to bury the results about themselves. But when it's attached to the name of the company and it's attached to the actual wallet that the company uses to actually give feedback on its employees, then it's harder to get rid of it. So basically in this in our world, people are less likely to fake their own credentials because now they have a record of it, and also like you're able to keep track of companies a lot more because now you're able to have a centralized location to see where it happened, where these like experiences and these past like traits or the things that people attach onto this company. Second is on traits. Basically, why are people likely to give accurate traits to one another? Well, first, it's their identity. People are people are defined basically by the traits that they have. And secondly, that it's comparatively harder to get multiple wallets rather than having multiple social media accounts. I'd like to note that there is incentive on our world to make it such that people do not have a lot of wallets. One, it's harder to manage on the back and as the person owning these wallets. And second, it's like it's a hassle to have multiple wallets at the same time because now you're gonna have to receive multiple sets of feedback, and it's going to be like, it's just code basically, and you're able to you're losing credentials on one wallet to have it to another wallet. And basically, say that, having a soulbound token of your traits would be a scarlet letter to carry with you the rest of your life if you get a bad review. The blockchain is linear. You can pinpoint when coins enter the wallet, and you can pinpoint when these things are attached to you. So for example, you get the dishonest trait tagged on you by an ex-partner. Yes, marginally, people will be more wary of you because now you have this tag bound to your identity, but it also means you have the more active incentive to change and prove this tag wrong because other people are also able to give you the different tags, which means that you actually need to prove to others that you have changed for them to actually say, oh no, you're actually a pretty honest person, you've changed from where you are, I will give you the honest tag. And then see that over time you're going to show that you're actually making change with your life, even if it is still attached to your name. Basically, in our world, you give more incentive people to act better towards people because at the point which you don't get tied down to the soulbound tokens. But on weighing, even if you don't have the ability to change these traits, I posit that it's better when you see the traits of people you interact with because you get to be more cautious and you get to see similar characteristics that you share. Second is basically, how do you protect minorities and just reduce online harassment? Basically, given the characterization of these that the soulbound tokens are widespread within society, it's reasonable to assume that a lot of people have one, or almost everyone has one. But through this, you remove the ability to have anonymity for people online, because when the tokens become widespread, that only the point at which you force people to tie their identity with the characteristics they pinpoint to other people, this is comparatively much better than status quo, where people have anonymity in social media, because you incentivize people to act more maliciously because you can't trace them back to their identities. But because you can't bury or erase your data anymore, that's unlikely for them to act this way. This is important because the comparative of social media necessitates that you can just delete your tweets or hide your digital footprint. And on our side, you don't do that because it's attached to your name. The impact of this is quite clear. People are less likely to be discriminatory online because even on the case where they act maliciously, you're able to pinpoint certain characteristics towards them more accurately, and you're able to see who gave it to you. Conclusion is, people will not be able to hide behind anonymity anymore. And even if there is some level of anonymity on either side, there's less anonymity insofar as these tokens are tied to a specific person. You're able to prevent things like harassment or malicious behavior to a larger extent. So on our side, we are able to get more transparency, see the transparency on the individual level and on the company level. And also we're able to pinpoint those who actually give these traits to other people. So you're also able to hold those people accountable if ever they become racist. So that goes.
I'd like to thank the first affirmative speaker for that speech and welcome the first negative speaker.
Hi. Okay. Oh, okay. Sure. 3, 2, 1. Ay, my timer. All right. 3, 2, 1. Let's go. On side negative, we suggest that the existence of an SBT already worsens cases of inequality, divide, and discrimination in a world that is already so full of it. The first vibe check I want to give towards side affirmative is, what exactly is an SBT? Because they're suggesting that similar, for example, to The Sims or any other game, it's often an identity marker. What we would suggest rather more specifically is a social credit system. On top of the fact, for example, that you can identify who is a dishonest individual, who is a good communicator, who graduated from a tier 15 college, it also determines, for example, things like your purchasing power, whether or not you will be granted a loan, and other things like that that greatly affect the lives of a lot of the individuals that will be forced to live under the SBT system. This is not often tagged by souls because the suggestion, for example, from side of primitive is that any individual can tag you with certain types of traits. But the implication from the motion is that there is a separate body, and especially if we want to take the best case of side of primitive, wherein this is done securely, wherein this is done to the maximum degree to which this can be objective, we would suggest it's not your friends or your ex-boyfriend who are going to be the souls that will tag you with certain chips or certain SBTs. Rather, it's the government. Rather, it's corporations and firms or even banks. The second vibe check I want to give is let's engage exactly with what primitive wants to achieve. We personally thought they were going to run about how this incentivizes people to learn more skills and be better people. But apparently the first argument from side of primitive was that, well, it will be significantly more difficult to lie on a job application or lie on social media. Anonymity is bad. Even if this is what the debate is about, they still don't win it from first affirmative. The first reason is because there's no meaningful change. They don't explain why just because there is a chip by your side or, for example, an SBT by your side, why is that meaningfully different from, let's say, a resume? Insofar as, for example, on a resume, for example, that's still something you will have that will be vetted by the employer. But the second idea is that they assert that the souls are significantly more objective. And even if, for example, even under their model wherein they imply that souls can be people like your boyfriend, people like, for example, your exes, people who have vested interest to frame you in a severely subjective, positive or negative way, we're unsure as to whether or not they're significantly as objective as they promise. But lastly, for example, the issue on a lot of the things that they try to rectify, like for example, lying on your resume, saying bad things on Twitter under the veil of anonymity, are instantly fixed by a lot of the things that exist in society and do not need an SBT to come into the advent in order for them to be fixed. So for example, if someone makes a bad tweet, you can have a screenshot, your digital footprint will be banned. If you're lying on your CV, a lot of HR departments are already making due diligence and doing background checks by calling the individuals that you are required to submit prior to submitting your CV. So for a lot of the stuff that tries to prove, other than it is not within the heart of the debate, it is also not super instantaneously solved by an SBT. The first thing I want to argue is on inequality and how this is, still a benefit or rather a harm on either side of the debate. Who often makes the decisions of what is considered a good SBT and a negative SBT? First, it's often by perceived social confirmation. So the idea that this towards good order, for example, there's an aversion towards those that create violence, those that create protests. Second of all, it often advocates for a monolithic understanding of what is good. So often insofar as this is done by banks, for example, or states, often there is an aversion towards certain political beliefs or certain methods of executing those political beliefs. Third, a lot of it is ruled by perception, which is often affected by double standards. So for example, while both men and women can be good communicators, when it comes to flagging them in the workplace, women can be perceived as bossy if they are a good communicator in comparison to men. That being a good communicator is simply just that. Who often gets negatively affected by SBTs, therefore? First, often these are protected identities, people like women, individuals who have autism, ADHD, and other behavioral disabilities. Second, a lot of them are victims of circumstance. Individuals who are poor feel the need like they have to steal because they're starving. Third, this often becomes significantly more worse with conservative, bigoted, and inconsiderate societies and nations. Especially these are the ones with the highest rates of inequality. There are 7 impacts, therefore, under this argument. First, often you deprive a lot of individuals towards modes of payment and purchasing power, or, for example, to be considered for a loan. Second, there's a large learning curve for some good traits. So, for example, it takes a while for you to be honest. It takes a while for you to be a good communicator. It takes a while for you to be a lot of good things, insofar as there are barriers like mental issues and other things like that. Third, often a lot of these people who are already disadvantaged by birth often get left behind because while the good individuals who are often middle class, rich, don't have a lot of reasons to be bad individuals, continue to accumulate more benefits through the SPT system. They get college, they live in gated communities, they get therapy. The opportunities are skewed in their favor, and the poverty and the lack of access to opportunities that are in the end of poor people allow them to further themselves as individuals who are seen as bad because they have worse college degrees, they become more dishonest people, they steal, for example, and other things like that. Fourth, as per the info slide, redistribution of wealth via SBTs is impossible because according to the info slide, you can't replicate this SBT, you can't transfer this SBT. Therefore, things like tax, which is exclusive through fiat currency, are impossible. 5, you behold yourself to the whims of the souls, affects agency and autonomy, and makes room for populism because things like protesting and critiquing the government and critiquing institutions become difficult. 6, often it's about worry and perceived harm. It doesn't have to be that you will automatically get a negative SBT, therefore you will do it. If you think you are likely to get a negative SBT because of a certain action or because of a certain behavior, you are likely to be fearful for your life and therefore not protest, not criticize, etc. 7, it also increases abuse towards people who are already vulnerable. Individuals who have ADHD and autism can already further be oppressed by their own parents because they're seen as useless because they contribute negative SBTs to the household. People who are in poverty will be associated with incompetence and lack of morals, and therefore it's less likely for them to be accepted into college, less likely for them to be given a loan, less likely for them to be accepted towards a job. At the end of this, we prove that on affirmative, significant forms of equality severely exist. This doesn't exist in the status quo to a lesser severe degree. The next argument I want to put forward is that it devalues social good. So we would suggest there are a couple of perverse incentives that would come about as the result of an SBT system. First is a lot of social perception. Your good traits will be commodified and reduced to an SBT. Second of all, people will self-improve on the basis of just wanting an SBT. Why is this generally bad? It's on the principle level because we would suggest it's important that the crux of why people want to improve, gain skills, and be good to other individuals is on the basis of the good itself, as opposed to the perceived benefit of a positive SBT. Second of all, we think there are already existing incentives for people to be good in status quo. So things like religion and goodwill that focus on not just being good because there is the peril of heaven or hell or reward or punishment, but because it is good to be a good individual. But lastly, we would suggest that good deeds become very undignified under side affirmative. The last argument I want to put forward is how this broadly affects the economy. So the broad frame here is that under market segmentation, there are a lot of industries that will take a severe hit because the main individuals that buy into their economy or buy into their market are those who are affected by having a lot of negative SBTs. So for example, in states where in China, wherein things like video games are bad, a lot of the people who are gamers will have negative SBTs. People who are under medication will be perceived as individuals who aren't good communicators, don't have good behavioral skills, and therefore their purchasing power or, for example, their perception as a result of the SBT or their perceived goodness in society is significantly lower. There are 4 broad impacts that affect the economy and the people within that economy. First, it means that they have less purchasing power. We proved this already in argument 1. The second one is they often mean that they have less purchases that are made towards many crucial industries. For example, video game industries, industries that require a lot of funds, for example, alcohol and other vices. For example, medication as well. But third, this means that the fall of these industries means the loss of jobs. So a lot of people who work within the manufacturing lines, the people that resell a lot of these products. But third, this means that a lot of the loans and money and investment was taken or, for example, used in order for these industries to prop up. Often small businesses to medium business, for example, will fall and will be defaulted on. And generally, this is just bad for a lot of individuals that exist within the economy. On these multiple fronts, on inequality, on social good, and also how it affects the economy, it is already on multiple impacts a clear negative ballot.
I'd like to thank the first negative speaker for that speech and welcome the second affirmative speaker.
Hello, let me give a minute to just drink water. Right. Hello, am I audible and visible?
Yep.
Okay, thanks. Just in case anyone will need, no preferred gender pronouns. Okay. Speech starting in 3, 2, 1, go. When everyone is anonymous, that is the point at which you aren't able to hold people accountable. The flow of my speech will go as follows. 1, I'm going to clear up the frame, but especially clear up what the implications of the SBT are, and secondly, clear up the implication of what souls are and who can give and who can act as these souls. Secondly, I'll be quite clear in responding to the first negative speaker in this debate, but thirdly, just one discussion on why given that these are the widespread use of SBTs, how we're able to affirm a lot of the harms coming from negative bench. First, let's strip the frame. What are the characteristics of the SBT? You assign traits to these people. You can have things like medical or educational backgrounds on these tokens, but these are crucially characteristics that make up a person or identity. So what can you do with this SBT? I think it's reasonable to assume that you have the ability to initially set up traits for yourself in the status quo. Secondly, how do these souls function, and who can give you these traits? I think it's twofold. One, it's like that people have the capacity to do so, i.e., it looks like, probably making a comment that this person, this person is kind or this person isn't kind. But secondly, even if it's governments or big organizations, as First Negative would like to point out, I think that they are unlikely to apply more extreme forms of more malicious forms of characteristics, because even then it probably looks like applying existing biases towards these people. So it's unclear to me as to why SPTs significantly make this worse, insofar that it is literally just a background check, i.e. if the person comes from a community that is likely very poor in skill, they're likely to go through a background check and they're likely to reaffirm it based on the SPT. But secondly, let's be quite clear in responding against First Negative in this debate. What did they say? They first say that the SPT is likely to function as a social credit system and determine things like purchasing power and just make it worse for minorities. The response is quite simple. I think this is highly symmetric because one, social credit systems or the systems by which the systems by which people discriminate just generally occur everywhere, i.e. banks do background checks or jobs already do background checks. Because if banks and jobs are already discriminatory and the margin of the harm they try to point out doesn't significantly change the way that minorities are affected or the way that banks act towards these people, then clearly that isn't the margin of debate. We posit from first up that the margin of this debate is protecting the people on the ground. But secondly, they claim that it incentivizes that you aren't able to incentivize people to act much better. But that is our entire second point on anonymity, because the comparative on their side is social media. They claim that they can just screenshot, but the counterclaim to that is that they can easily just delete that. So the change on our side, or the comparative, and why that's much better, is because you tie certain characteristics to the SPT, i.e. they cannot escape that the fact they were probably racist, or they make a snarky comment, or they offended someone. But they say that this is just going to be, but additionally, they say that this is going to be a social credit system, and this is bad because it affects everyone's ability to get a loan. There are three responses to this. One, this is not likely going to be things like China's social credit system. The people that own it are not from a totalitarian government, and therefore it is unlikely that the harms that First Negative proposes are going to accrue. Secondly, if it becomes widespread, it's not only going to be used by people from one area of the world, it's likely going to be used by multiple people around the world who have different values and backgrounds, and therefore that diversity is the mechanism why there's going to be massive clamor to make sure that the social credit system works. Governments are likely going to be involved in this in a very unprecedented way, and therefore that's the biggest incentive to not make this bad, given that it is very widespread and it's really important to society. But three, there's also an individual incentive for maintaining the SPT blockchain to keep the system as accurate and equal as possible, insofar as corporations want to find good workers, but also to prevent other corporate competitions from abusing the system and needlessly attacking each other. So what did these following lines of response do? One, it disproves their entire case. Oh my God. Hello, did I get disconnected?
Yeah, you did. But I've paused your timer, so feel free to keep going whenever you're ready.
Okay. Where was the last? What was the last thing you heard?
You said that corporations wanted good workers, which was an incentive to keep the blockchain good.
Okay. I will continue. How much time do you have on your timer?
I'm at 3:55.
Okay, sure. Okay. Okay. Restarting in 3, 2, 1, go. Corporations want to find good workers, but also you're able to prevent other corporate competitors from abusing the system and needlessly attacking each other. So what is the following lines of response to the negative case? Two things. One, it disproves their entire case on economic harms, because it's unlikely that it's going to be used recklessly, given that we give the incentives for governments or just any corporations in general to maintain, just to generally maintain the system, because it is inherently widespread, or it's very important within society in our world. But secondly, it means that our material on transparency and accountability still stand. The comparative is clearly much better on negative. The comparative is better because negative has to defend a world where social media does this, where all of our mechanisms of arbitrary social attribution still apply, but with significantly less oversight and just significantly significantly more autonomy, which causes much more people to be discriminatory towards actors. But what do they say as contributions? They say that one, it's likely going to be a perceived social confirmation theory, or secondly, you reduce good traits and you commodify it. The response to this is quite simple. First, I'd posit that it's good that you're able to commodify, or at the very least lower the barrier to entry for these good acts, because for these good traits or good acts, because these people have the incentive to act benevolently towards the people on the ground. So maybe at worst it's tokenistic, but at the very least people are likely to interact benevolently to some extent, like in our world. But thirdly, they say that they try to point out how you worsen jobs or you worsen conditions. But I don't think that the SBT is a tipping point for you to be able to change economic structures, or that's the entire reason for why people are going to lose jobs. There are exogenous reasons why SMEs or people get fired, i.e. market changes or just generally the lack of capital. But secondly, I think that those stereotypes that are prevalent in negatives world are unlikely to change on either side of the house. Why is this likely? Because you don't change because just generally these stereotypes have been embedded for so long. But secondly, just generally, I don't think that you're able to provide existing incentive for, let's say, racists or people who are misogynist to change. So the margin, therefore, is where we're able to protect the minorities on the ground. Given that and onto my one discussion then on why is the widespread SBT so crucial. Given that this is widespread, this implies two things. One, first is massive amounts of regulation. Why is this likely? Three layers. One, given that this is commonplace, it's likely going to act how people call each other on social media. People are likely to point out flaws in the way people put traits on people or corporations. But thirdly, you are likely to act benevolently and be more cautious towards the way that you put traits on these people. But secondly is on engagement. Even if people withhold their opinions on our side and keep it to themselves, I'd posit that this is much better because you don't make remarks willy-nilly, and you're more likely to be careful about how you ascribe traits to people when it's tied to your identity. But secondly, even if people make unintended remarks, I think we're more able and more likely to hold them accountable when it's prevalent on the ledger. But secondly, I think that people just intuitively understand that we generally judge people, so I don't think that this generally matters if they say that. So the conclusion here is quite simple, that there's likely to be massive amounts of regulation both for the corporate and the government end, but secondly, people on the ground, i.e. just because of the simple fact that, if you make a snarky comment or you make negative comments about a person, they're likely to, just call you out on these things. But secondly, the second implication is there are massive amounts of maintenance and upkeep on the system. Why is this likely? Given that a lot of people use this and it's important to the lives of people who have the capacity to upkeep are likely to go into maintaining these things, and there's likely going to have a market that arises from it being widespread. So corporations are likely to pay these people. So what does that imply? It implies twofold. That one, people on the blockchain are then likely to help support the maintenance of the system. But secondly, it's important because it just really proves why the system won't crash. But thirdly, why governments and corporations have an incentive to just upkeep the system. So what are the strategic implications of my speech? One, we respond quite clearly to the first negative on how, one, it isn't a social credit system, but even in the case where it is a social credit system, governments, corporations, and individuals have an incentive to keep that to just certainly act benevolently, or to just have or to maintain it to the greatest extent possible. But secondly, why their points on inequality doesn't change because those stereotypes are massively inculcated within minds of people. But thirdly, we flipped our harm on good traits. 40, we prove why their point on economics isn't the tipping point. But 50, we prove why our point on anonymity still stands within the round of firm things.
I'd like to thank the second affirmative speaker here, and would like to welcome the third negative speaker.
Hi, am I audible and visible?
Yep.
Okay, thank you. Let me just drink water first. Okay. If I suddenly start becoming disconnected, please tell me so that I can, yeah. Speech start In 3, 2, 1. It is egregious when apps responds to our arguments about inequality as to how you repress social change and how you devastate economies is them saying that it will happen anyway. This is not the basis of any policy. The same with affirmative action. When you do affirmative action or try to redistribute wealth, sure, poverty still exists. Sure, some individuals will still be racist. But the point of doing these actions is trying to reparate these damages and make it less worse than it already. What I'm going to do in this speech is 3 things. Firstly, on inequality. Secondly, on social change. And lastly, on economy. Why on our side, it is far better than an app where they institutionalize this to SBTs. Responses will be integrated in my speech. The first issue I want to discuss is on inequality. There are 3 points I want to do here. Firstly, I want to ask what is perceived as good, and explain structural reasons as to why it is likely to be skewed. Firstly, the people who make the coins, programmers, usually are predominantly rich, predominantly privileged, predominantly men and white, and therefore their perception of morality will be skewed when they make the SBTs or system to begin with, that they're likely to think tax evasion, because they benefit from it, is more moral than petty theft. Because they don't do petty theft, but poor marginalized individuals are more likely to do that. The second thing that we experience in terms of majoritarian perspective, if it's democratic and A3 explicitly says this is a terrible thing. One, there are more people in developing countries. So we presume that their norms, which are usually conservative and traditional, are likely to win out compared to the very, very progressive countries that have very few populations anyway. But secondly, even rich and progressive countries like the US and the United Kingdom are not bastions of progressivity anymore, with the rise of populism, with the backtracking or resurgence of sexism with the reversal of Roe v. Wade, or the rising transphobia in the UK. They got this magic bullet theory and magic bullet and say that the West is the land of the free. Clearly, this is lazy argumentation from their end. The second thing is engaging on the best case. Even if it's objectively good, we argued why a lot of these quote-unquote good attributes are skewed in favor of privileged individuals. That to be charitable, you have to assume money, that being optimistic is a privilege or reserved for those who are not exposed to daily hardship and loss. Things that the poorest of the individuals and the most marginalized of society do not have. So even if progressive countries check it or check and balance it, it doesn't matter. Being objectively good or trying objectively favorable traits is still disadvantageous. But the third thing, and I want to forward this in terms of Wayne, who are corporations and banks to dictate your private life? Because insofar as, for example, you are moody in your private life, you don't like interacting with individuals, but when you're at work, you're able to do your job properly, you actually talk with your colleagues. Or when you're a smoker in your private life, but you don't smoke at work, they shouldn't be able to discriminate you on the basis of these things. F says that, well, we want to keep away from racists, harassers, and people who harm you. One, there are background checks that are already able to do this. But secondly, if it's true that these things are very monumental to the existence of the company, then presumably these companies and banks are likely to have stringent processes anyway. What they don't account for are the other things or other attributes that are not quote unquote necessary for the operation of a company or a bank, but are things that they can discriminate you for. On weighing then, firstly, in terms of banks and companies, let's assume that all these attributes do matter to them. We think the difference, and what they point us out, is that the entire world knows that you're poor. The entire world knows you're anxious. The entire world knows that you did not go to university. And that's a shameful, or that's undignifying to an individual who feels shame for not being able to do these things. It is necessary probably in applying for a loan and going and get a job, but it's understood why a stranger all across the world has to know these things. Secondly, in terms of stereotypes, as I've already precluded, we just don't want to make it worse. Like an intuition pump here is just affirmative action. Yeah, racism doesn't go away, but the thing is, we do not want to make it worse anymore than it is. Why do we win then? Firstly, we don't strip people of their dignity, especially when they have attributes that one, they don't have control over, but two, companies, the banks might need, but the whole entire public doesn't have to know it. Secondly, that we protect them from further discrimination, because on our side, you have incentives of things like interviews, or you're not literally vetoed already from the screening process and they give you a chance to explain yourself. But thirdly, in terms of like certainty. We're unsure if we're able to get the impacts of lessening the amount of racists, lessening the amount of sexual harassers and predators, but we are sure that we're able to harm the most vulnerable of individuals. And even if at worst it is a negative case, we think not being able to cause harm on others is a benefit, because that means individuals who don't lose opportunities, individuals who get a chance in life where they otherwise wouldn't have had. We win this issue. The second issue I want to talk about is in terms of social change. So in the same way as how on app you can presumably check their sentiments or perspectives towards race and sex, presumably you could also check their sentiments and views towards labor unions, higher minimum wage, and all these other things. First thing is that a lot of corporations and banks negatively perceive labor unions or people in favor of rising minimum wages. These are perceived to be more negative than being sexist or racist for a few reasons in this way. Firstly, the CEOs or the higher ups might agree to this sentiment, especially if they happen to be white, they happen to be racist themselves, and no one can check and balance, especially when they own a lot of these things. The second thing is that this is more pernicious in industries where minorities make a small part of the workforce to begin with. For example, in medicine, where women do not consist a large population of doctors, or in the tech industry, which is dominated mostly by white individuals. So they're not likely to care about whether you're outright racist or sexist, because not much of the workforce is, but they care about whether or not you support the union or support higher minimum wage, because it directly threatens the company. The second thing is that it leads them to the chilling effect that we were explaining, and they do not explain or try to prove any of these to this stance. Their response is to say accountability, but take note, it is very knowable that H&M is exploitative. Oil companies harm the environment. Amazon underpays their workers, but people don't boycott them because they're integrated to our lives. So in terms of weighing, the fact of corporations who hold other corporations accountable is less salient than what we explained. That it's easier for corporations to literally deprive individuals who they think might try to push for social changes within their company, might try to join a labor union, and therefore try to reform the practices that are inherently exploitative. In terms of impact, this is very clear from our side, and I just want to bring it up so that the lie from AFP doesn't stand. That more people on our side join unions, more people on our side join social movements that guarantee change, they're more likely to be more open to being critical of the government when you don't have to walk around literally displaying all these things above their heads and making them targets for discrimination. Then we win on this issue, because not only is ours more exclusive, but it is an upside where a lot of the harmful things such as racism and sexism is more entrenched, especially since these individuals, presumably these corporations, presumably do not care as much as they do the progressive attributes that they likely target. For all this and more, we're very proud to.
I'd like to thank the third negative speaker and welcome the negative reply.
Side negative emphasizes that on the basis of inequality, economy, and social goods, side affirmative loses. First, on inequality. The first question we ask ourselves is, are these souls biased? Second, affirmative concedes the regulation, but insofar as they do, there is little to no response regarding to how there are different values from individual to individual. It's quite likely that the governments, the firms, and the individual programming these processes are those that favor males, for example, favor the rich, for example, favor a lot certain types of political beliefs. And this was largely exploited by Alex in their third negative speech. And this was largely unresponded to, or largely not preempted to, by the entirety of affirmative. The second thing is, independent of this, both affirmative and negative agree that there are certain bad attributes that will result in bad SBTs. We, though, prove at first negative why this is the most damning thing to affirmative bench, because it often worsens cycles of poverty, discrimination, and it ensures that individuals who are already born into this world with a lot of disadvantages, whether it be behavioral deficiencies, whether or not it's poverty, whether or not it's being a woman, for example, will stay in the unfavorable and deplorable conditions that they are living in. The last thing that comes from inequality on side affirmative is, well, you don't change their bigotry anyway. And I hope that it's clear all throughout me, Pao, and Alex, but we said it's not necessarily just about eradicating bigotry. We never promised that. It's about not adding additional things in society that enable that bigotry to be manifested. And insofar as SBTs allow individuals to, flag people by their insufficiencies, flag people, for example, who are of certain types of attributes, we worsen or often on affirmative, a lot of this discrimination is worsened. Affirmative says that there is protection, but literally how? Because you can get discriminated when they still see that anonymous person with SBT XYZ is a woman, didn't have a diploma, for example, especially insofar as this thing is public, and this is something that's agreed upon throughout the whole debate. The second part is on economy. So the defense from second affirmative is that there are different exogenous factors for why certain markets may shut down. Panel, this is true for status quo, but not to the extent for affirmative for the reasons that we said as early as first negative. The idea that some people will lose SBTs, will gain negative SBTs. This means that a lot of the markets that rely upon them, especially, for example, those who are smokers in their private lives, people who like to video game, for example, will lose purchasing power and therefore be unable, for example, to participate in these markets. And that's what allows the shutdowns to occur through a higher degree or through a more massive degree than affirmative is willing to admit. The next thing they say is that there are corporate disincentives to use this to not disempower buyers. But like, why? Because on affirmative, it's either we sacrifice policing people's behavior to mitigate markets not taking a hit, or negative, or rather affirmative has to accept that markets do take a hit, but we are not able to police behaviors and do all the social order benefits that they promise on side affirmative. The last thing we want to discuss is on social goods. So the first part is anonymity. First of all, there are a couple of questions to this anonymity issue. It's like, first of all, who do we trust exactly to do the assignment on labeling certain individuals? And the problem with this is that we point out that insofar as you can't verify it, it's very difficult to see if the person is actually someone who possesses these attributes based on what the souls say. Second of all, anonymity often models accountability, because even if it's true that X anon user has certain types of bad and bigoted attributes, how do we go through the process of holding accountable? How do I identify them such that we can put them to court? How do we identify them such that it becomes harder for them to gain a job? Or for example, if they're a sexual offender, how do we identify them such that we ensure that they don't become a teacher, they're not put in front of kids and other things like that? But even then, a lot of the things that they say, basic things they say, are mitigatable. We say things like background checks, due diligence. A lot of this is already not necessarily super debate winning for side affirmative. We suggest that the inequality arguments are significantly more important. The comparative from second affirmative is that they have less cost allegedly. But one, won't you review resumes anyway? So you'll still incur costs on top of the cost that you incur from participating in SBTs. But if not, if you don't review the resumes, then does that not prove the argument that we prove on first negative about how we undermine people's hard work and merit by kicking into SBTs? So for all these reasons and more, it is a clear neck ballot.
Thank the negative reply speaker for that speech and welcome the affirmative reply.
Yeah, just drink water, hold up.
Yep.
Hello. Am I audible?
Yep.
Okay, thanks. Okay, reply in 3, 2, 1, go. Let's be quite clear with the comparison as to what affirmative and negative gives you in this debate. What is negative trying to tell you? They claim 3 things. 1, this is going to be a social credit system. It's not subject to majoritarian belief. And that the ST is likely going to determine the way institution acts towards these minorities. Secondly, that you lock out the minority and you punish them for things that they cannot control. But thirdly, it's likely that there's government silencing on a vast majority of businesses. The problem with this, and I'd like to know at the top, before I get on to what affirmative says in reply to their points, is that negative is not defending their comparative, where social media is the primary way by which all of these harmful things are done. So what do we say then in response to the 3 main pushes? First, on social credit and government silencing. We explain why it's unlikely to going to function like a social credit system. But even if it does, what do we explain? We explain why government and corporations have the incentive to act benevolently then. We explain why when it is widespread, it outframes the vast majority of harms coming from negative, but we engage further. There on like a couple of levels then. First, we say that there's a massive amount of regulation at the point at which the entire world has to use it. So there's incentive then for the government to work well with the SBT. It streamlines all the info to name, but they're forced to hedge against all of the bad things that they do because people can now easily point it out. But secondly, they're able to pander to the incentive of corporations, i.e. they want to find good workers, i.e. they want to make sure that they're first in the market. But secondly, you're able to pander to people on the ground because you're then unlikely to be discriminatory towards other people because it's tied your identity that they can pinpoint to you as you being racist or being a bigot. But even in the worst case, we explain why their people's identities are out. We explain why that you are able to give them an exclusive mechanism to combat these said atrocities that negative wants to like solve. But secondly, on locking out minorities, we explain why people have the ability to assign characteristics themselves initially. But secondly, we also explain why the reason why they are locked out is because of societal narratives that get perpetuated on either side. They claim it's actively worse, but we explain on engagement that sure, even if it does get worse on our side, you're then only able to call these people out when there are no levels of anonymity because of the SBT. Because on their side, people can hide behind the anonymity of social media. They can make another account. They can hide their digital footprint. What then changes on our side is that generally you have to tie your person, you have to tie your name and just your credentials to that, like to that token or to that coin. But I'd like to note here that it was too late at third negative to try and prove why the SPTs are likely going to be bad in nature. But because we already preempt this when we claim that the widespread use of the SPT necessitates that there's one, massive amounts of regulation, but secondly, upkeep within the system. But also explain why that everyone has the capacity to give traits as a soul, but more completely that it isn't the margin of this debate. Because sure, at worst we add more we add more harms, but you give exclusive mechanisms to which people can combat those harms that we add. On affirmative, you aren't on negative value, you aren't able to call them out when they remain anonymous. Because at the very least on F, you're able to call them out to some extent when you tie it to the identity of the person. So what do we say as positive material, and why is this our winning condition? So we have two things. One is on transparency. We say two things. One, you're less likely to have fake degrees as serves or fake degrees or just any fake credentials. But secondly, you have a centralized location for information. So powerful companies are able to bury this information when it's spread across the internet and various social media platforms, all negative. But when you have it on the company wallet itself, then the company things can't just be easily buried. But the second condition we had is that you have the active incentive to change. And this is the exclusive mechanism that you get down the affirmative bench. Because now you tie it down to the identity permanently. You're able to call these people out when you tie it down to their identity. You incentivize, but secondly, you incentivize people to do better. Because even if it becomes a social credit system, as negative tries to assert, we say, then that's good then. Because you force people to afterwards be tokenistically good towards each other. You lower the barrier or just the barrier of entry for these people to act benevolently. But thirdly, we say why we're able to track those people who give bad reviews, because it acts as a self-correcting mechanism when people can rate you and you can rate them. But quickly, you're able to prevent a lot of these things on discrimination and harassment when you have to tie it onto the person, or you have to out the racists or out the bigots. Because we explain why quite concretely, even in the worst case where there are more harms on our side, we explain why we're able to mitigate significantly those harms, or just generally why it's worse on negatives world. Thanks.
To thank the affirmative reply speaker for that. Okay, thanks everyone for that debate. We think that teams did a really good job in general, particularly given that there were a lot of moving parts going on. So it was nice to see a lot of those get resolved. The way that I'm going to structure this is firstly give a couple of points of general feedback, then I'm going to give you the decision, and then I'm going to explain how we reached it. So 3 things to note in general feedback. The first one is that we think that teams could have spent a little bit more time in setup, not only explaining what they thought the world was in terms of who is assigning these tokens, etc., but also explaining reasons to believe that that was the plausible characterization in this debate. We think that teams were overly reliant on the judges buying that their setup was intuitively true. And in this case, we didn't really think that either team was clearly more intuitive than the other one in terms of whether this was mostly done by governments and corporations or whether this was done more broadly. So we think it's important to really give some reasons to back that up. The second thing is that on rebuttal, it's important to really try to directly engage with the other team's priorities and what they are doing, rather than just rebuilding people's own cases. Teams had very different kind of sets of priorities in this debate, but we think that they were overly inclined to rebut the other team's claims in 1 or 2 sentences or question its relevance, and then just reassert the claims that came out substantively. And while that's sometimes fine, we think that in a debate as close as this one, it would have been really helpful if you were to just spend a little bit more time giving some flat responses to the other team's mechanisms, impacts, etc. Finally, it's important in this debate that people establish a little bit more why these tokens are something that is so impactful and that people assign so much value to. There's kind of an assumption in this debate that people care about them quite a bit, but we don't get a clear sense of the scale of why this is likely to be something that you weigh significantly more than a police check or a police reference, or significantly less, why you take this more seriously than what you've heard kind of word on the street. So while we do understand that they're permanent and that everyone can see them, that doesn't necessarily mean that everyone values them, and it would have been helpful for both teams to explain the extent to which they thought that these tokens were valued. Ultimately, in what was an incredibly close debate, we did reach a unanimous decision, which was to award the debate to the negative team. So congratulations to Ateneo 3. Three main questions in getting there. Firstly, on the impact around employment. Secondly, on whether this system necessarily makes people nicer. And finally, then on the impacts that this has on particularly disenfranchised or vulnerable groups. So let's start with the employment impacts. To start with here, the affirmative team points to things like LinkedIn not necessarily, or resumes being particularly accurate because people are able to embellish them themselves and are able to change things. The first thing that we both kind of felt is that there wasn't a clear enough establishment of what problem the affirmative team was trying to solve here, or why it is so bad if people are able to misrepresent themselves in these ways. So while we absolutely did buy that probably is easier without these tokens to embellish things in these ways, there wasn't a particularly clear impact link to this particular line of argument because we weren't convinced that we didn't get an explanation as to why this was a really widespread and terrible practice, or why when it did happen, it was something that we all care about so much. And so at that point, while we think that a lot of what was said here was true, it wasn't necessarily like the most impactful claim in the debate. In contrast, from the negative team, we get the idea, and this develops relatively late in the bench, that some of the traits that you're likely to be picking up on are not necessarily the most relevant ones, and that maybe this is too expansive compared to something like a resume that is more kind of stable and you only have more professional things there. So, for example, we get a really good lineup response from the third negative speaker who explains that there are issues with the way that maybe if you're just a bit moody at home, but you're a really good employee, why should that factor into your employment decision? And so maybe it's better to have a more limited range of information. They also point out that there are a range of mechanisms that can be used to combat the issues that the affirmative team talks about. They talk about things like kind of reference checking, and talk about things like getting police checks. And so for the worst kind of harms of the largest misrepresentations, or the people who are the least qualified or least suitable for the roles getting into them, there were likely mechanisms, even without these tokens, that would allow you to filter out those candidates. So at the end of this debate, while we thought that you probably did get slightly more accurate employment, you thought that this was a marginal enough consequence, given that you could already filter out the worst cases of it, that it didn't weigh particularly heavily in the debate. Secondly, then, let's look at the impact on whether this makes people nicer or not. And first thing that the affirmative team establishes here, or one of their major claims, is around how this gets rid of anonymity to a really large extent and how this stops people from behaving badly online. The first thing is that neither of us got a particularly clear understanding of specifically why the introduction of these tokens would necessarily remove any form of anonymity from your lives. We didn't fully describe the argument because it gets more limited engagement than we would have expected from the negative team. But given the way that the motion is set up in the info slide and in the setup that we're given from First Affirmative, it was slightly unclear to us why you couldn't make any account on the internet in any form without attaching your tokens and system to it. And so some of these changes we thought was slightly tenuously linked to the topic. That said, we did think that they're particularly for the physical benefits, there was potentially a benefit that arose. So the idea that if you were having to be racist to someone and knew that you could now be tagged as racist in a really permanent way, that was likely to have a chilling effect on your activity, and that maybe you were likely to be nicer to the people around you. They also explain how this potentially provides you an incentive to improve. I think that First Affirmative sets this up particularly effectively, pointing about how potentially you've been tagged as dishonest, and that therefore you need to really try your best to prove your honesty if you want to overcome that label in a way that you might not otherwise. We didn't think that this was ultimately debate winning because the affirmative team was able to overcome it in a few ways. Firstly, they question whether it is particularly fair for us to have a universal value system that everyone needs to abide by. And while there are some behaviors that people thought were good and some behaviors that were generally bad, there was also a fair degree of middle ground, and that maybe this would incentivize things like encouraging compliant behavior at work, which isn't necessarily something that has an objective good, but might develop a good association within this system. Secondly, they point out that particularly in the affirmative world, where you're able to have people like your partners or your friends assigning these labels in the way that the affirmative team suggests that you could, that potentially isn't that reliable of a mechanism. And so you don't necessarily get that particularly good change, and that people might not be applying these tokens in the least malicious way possible. Then finally, they're able to establish that there are a range of other mechanisms people use to improve. This links back to a point of general feedback where we didn't get the clearer sense from the affirmative team of why these tokens were so much more devastating you or provided you so much more of an incentive to change than any of the existing social structures. So for example, why it, like kind of social isolation, being called out, anything like that, weren't enough to sway that behavior and why this was likely to do it to a much greater extent. So again, I think that there was still some remaining benefit at the end of this point because the permanency of these things probably did mean that it was a slightly larger incentive, but the negative team was able to draw sufficient doubt as to whether this was actually always going to be pushing you in the right direction and whether the labels that you were assigned were likely enough to be accurate all of the time, that we didn't think that this was a debate winning point. What we're then left in with is the material from the negative team on minorities, which was ultimately what both members of the panel thought was the determinative clash in this debate. We're given a range of reasons to believe that even if these tokens don't invent new biases, that they are likely to enforce and re-ingrain them to a certain extent, and that they're potentially likely to pull in things and make it really evident and clear to everyone that you interact with you have these traits. So for example, we hear that you're likely to now have to walk around with a permanent label telling people about things like your sexuality. And so even if you were able to self-assign these, which was a slightly questionable claim in the debate, given that that probably undercut a lot of the benefits or established earlier around people no longer being able to misrepresent themselves in favorable ways. But even if you could do that, the fact that other people could label you in malicious ways and attach things to you, and you had to put out things like your kind of socioeconomic status in a way that everyone could access, we were convinced that that was likely to be something that was quite embarrassing for you. We were also convinced that there were at least like some marginal harms that existed in terms of your capacity to access things like loans and employment, because while there are existing checks, those checks rely more on getting to know a person and developing a relationship with them in greater detail. Whereas under this system, when it kind of, there's the perception that these are really objective markers of who you are and your character, it's much easier to signal to those things and say, it's like, this objective label says that this person can't be trusted, whereas you would need to, it would be harder to do that, even if you're relying on the same bias in the negative team's world, because you still need to be able to plausibly justify why you've rejected the loan rather than just being able to kind of use the lens of objectivity that is granted by these particular labels to justify your decision for you. To really secure a win here, we would have liked the affirmative team, the negative team, to explain in a little bit more detail why these were likely to be kind of so devastating, or why this lens of objectivity was so strong and no one would question it or no one would be aware of the biases. And we felt that some of the impacts, particularly around things like the economic downfall, was slightly tenuously linked to the scale of change that was established, given that we didn't get that analysis about why these were like something that people took so incredibly seriously and couldn't weigh up against their other understandings. So for example, why the shame associated with the gamer label was likely to outweigh your desire to continue to purchase video games, things like that. But we did think that this was probably the largest harm in the debate because it like tangibly made life worse for minorities in a range of ways and stopped them from being able to access important opportunities and things in their lives. So very, very close debate. And we think that both teams did a really good job, but that was ultimately how it played out. Happy to answer questions here, to be messaged on Facebook or on Discord. Would also really encourage you all to chat to Eleanor as well, as she's got lots of really good thoughts on the debate. But for now, I will end that recording.